Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cone, and I'm delighted to serve as the host of this podcast series. Today, we are particularly fortunate to have with us Marie-Josee Privyk of Novisto. And when I looked at her LinkedIn profile, I was intrigued that her title was first human and then Chief ESG Innovation Officer at Novisto. She's experienced in capital markets, financial analysis, business valuation, corporate reporting, investor relations, and of course, sustainability. So welcome, MJ. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
So let's start out with a little bit of background. I think most of our listeners are probably familiar with you through your thought leadership and articles and activities on LinkedIn. But tell us a bit about your background and how you got into sustainability way back when. According to your LinkedIn profile, 2011, you were working in sustainability. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words and thanks for the opportunity. My background is, as you mentioned, capital markets, traditional, very much a financial analyst at heart, and I was a sell-side analyst for many years. So like many people, I would say, in the sustainability space today that are of a certain age or generation that aren't fresh out of school, they probably came to this space from another practice or profession. And that was very much the case for me. And I evolved over the years from finance, capital markets to a related field of activity, which was investor relations, sitting very much at the nexus between companies and investors, and very much involved in providing information to the investor or capital markets practitioners. And that's when I fell into the sustainable development, sustainability reporting, sustainable finance space. It was a little bit of an aha moment for me. Thank you, Oprah Winfrey. I can't even remember who gave me an article to read, but I think I just read an article and thought to myself, this totally makes sense. This is how businesses should be run. This is how finance should be done. It was actually giving finance its purpose back. This is how capital should be allocated. And I just started reading and following everything I could in the market. And the information is very much, and still today, in the market. The knowledge is in the market. There's no textbooks that summarize this and that you could just do a 3-month or 6-month course and then know everything there is to know about sustainability reporting or even sustainable finance. So I've been following this very, very closely for the last, I guess, 12 years now.
And then within the last 3 years or so, you've been working at Novisto. So tell us a little bit about them and how they found you and what enticed you to start working with them.
Yeah, that's a great way to formulate the question, by the way, how they found me. I was actually working on my own as a consultant advisor, and the Montreal sustainable finance ecosystem is relatively tight-knit. I would say large. I wouldn't say it's small. It's disproportionately large, but quite tight-knit. And sustainable finance, sustainability space, through 1 or 2 degrees of separation, came to meet the people at Novisto. Actually started doing offering a bit of advisory services to them in terms of that market expertise, market knowledge, read on the market and trends and what was happening in the space. And eventually, when the opportunity arose to join the company, I took it because, to me, software is a way, as they say, to democratize access. And it was a way for, I thought then, and I think now, a way to give access to thousands of companies to the transformation that needs to happen, to the shift to sustainability reporting, data mindset, quality, reliable data, etc. Much more so than I could have done as an independent advisor. Although, don't get me wrong, I really, really love the independent advisory work.
And so you touched a little bit on what it is Novisto does, software, data gathering, and described, like, how would you sell Novisto?
Sure. Thanks for the follow-up. I didn't describe what Novisto is. Novisto is an ESG data management software platform for companies. It is a tool to accelerate, facilitate the process of collecting what has largely been unstructured data, so data that lives, in a document or in a spreadsheet. Not standardizing it, but automating it, digitizing it, bringing it into a database, a system of record. Also, it offers the possibility of collecting data that already lives in other databases, because some of that data already is digitized and structured, but centralizing it all together in order to produce quality, reliable data that will be audit ready when those disclosures need to be audited, and that companies can then use to produce their reporting, answer third-party questionnaires, and ultimately also interrogate and use as a tool for managing those ESG programs, ESG issues, and sustainability sustainability programs to ultimately, improve their performance, achieve better outcomes.
So 2 follow-up questions to that. One is, I'm assuming that is your tool, and tools like your tool are going to be very necessary when it comes to providing assurance and auditable trails of all the ESG data that's being collected. And secondly, do you have a specific niche, like what industry, what size company is best suited for your services and tools?
Yeah, great question. I'll start with the second one. We actually don't have an area of specialization at this time, other than the fact that we're a tool for corporates, not a tool for other types of organizations or for investors and sustainable finance. But we are industry agnostic. We are public-private agnostic. We are size agnostic, in the sense that any company of any size potentially has or will eventually have a need for an ESG data management software platform, and the need for collecting that data and having, quality audit ready data, and then what it's going to be used for is actually relatively standardized or similar across industry, across company size, and increasingly will also be across companies, whether they are publicly listed or private. We're seeing it in Europe happening now. We could talk about that a little bit later on maybe, but the concept of sustainability is good for business. Sustainability is part of identifying impacts, risks, opportunities, things that companies need to manage because their decision-making stakeholders want to know what they're doing about it. That applies to any kind of company, not just publicly listed companies. So that's been our approach to the market. Arguably, the ones that have the most pressing needs today are the publicly listed ones, the larger ones, because they're the ones facing the greatest pressure from investors. And with respect to your first question, which is whether we are a necessary tool for companies in preparing audit-ready data, the short answer is yes. I firmly believe that companies are going to need an appropriate technology-based tool to help produce audit-ready data, quality data, have the traceability, the audit trail, but also validation rules, control, security measures in place that are all part of the broader internal control mechanisms that are part of an audit readiness assessment, and ultimately the ability to achieve external assurance.
And that leads me right into my next question. What do you see as the biggest trend hitting the sustainability reporting space right now?
Yeah, another great question. Our view of the market, my view of the market, and what's happening in the space right now is essentially that there is a significant transformation occurring, one that is driven by regulations. Regulations are telling companies you must disclose, but they're also telling companies you must disclose using a specific set of standards. Your disclosures must be externally assured, and your reports must be digitized and XBRL tagged. So the regulations make disclosures widely available. The standards are making them comparable. The external assurance are making them reliable. And the digitization and the XBRL tagging are making them readily accessible and discoverable and readable, not just by humans, but also by machines.
Huge shift in what's happening.
Yes, indeed.
what are your predictions when it comes to the regs? I mean, in your country, Canada, in the soon to be released SEC rules here in the US, and then also in the EU and the UK.
Yeah. Well, we're all taking a page from Europe, and everybody is really closely watching what's happening in Europe. And they are, yet again, as they have been for a while now, leading the way. And we're looking at the implementation of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is actually one of a whole slew of regulatory or legislative initiatives. This one is for corporates, but there's also the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is for investors. There's the EU Taxonomy, which happens to be for both. There's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which again is for companies, not so much about reporting, but about things they actually have to do with respect to human rights and climate change action, if you will, across their value chains. So there's a slew of regulations that are coming out of the European Union, and the CSRD is doing exactly what we just described in terms of the transformation in the market. The CSRD is the regulation. It is telling companies you have to disclose using the European standards. Your disclosures have to be audited and they have to be digitized, and it has to be in one document with your financial statements for the same reporting year, released at the same time. And the number of companies that are in scope is expanding dramatically from approximately 11,000 that are currently subject to the NFRD, which is the previously existing regulation, to an estimated 50,000 plus companies, large, small, public, and private.
And in addition to those companies that are currently regulated or soon will reach the thresholds to be regulated, I think there's a whole nother pack of companies out there that don't meet the regulatory thresholds, but they're a vendor or a supplier to those who do. And that's driving reporting and ESG compliance as well.
Absolutely, because one of the things that is very explicit in the European standards and in the IFRS standards as well, which we'll probably touch on a little bit later, is the concept of value chain. So companies needing to identify their material issues, impacts, risks, opportunities across their value chain. So not just their core business, but upstream suppliers, downstream customers. So yeah, you're right that there are actually going to be many, many more companies that are going to be affected, even though they're not actually meeting the size threshold. But also the size threshold is not that large. So for the smaller companies, I can't remember what it is. I can look for it if you want and find it. The threshold for most companies that are going to be in scope of the CSRD is really 2 out of the 3 following factors, and it's 250 employees, 40 million euros in revenues, 20 million euros in assets. That's not a very large size threshold.
Right.
To your earlier question, also elsewhere in the world, what are we seeing in terms of regulations? About 3 weeks ago, the UK government announced that it would be launching or developing its own corporate sustainability reporting standards that would be largely adopting the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. And we can expect that to happen in the next few years. And what's interesting there is it's both the government and the Financial Conduct Authority. So it's both the regulator of the capital markets, or so presumably publicly listed companies, but also from a government perspective, it can be any corporate entity. So the scope might actually be quite large, and I would suspect that they're going to be aligning themselves with what's happening in Europe, even though a big differentiator between the UK and the EU is obviously in terms of the standards that they're adopting, the UK going with the IFRS. In terms of Canada, my country, the Canadian Securities Regulators has indicated that it is looking forward to the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, which is the body that was created to adopt and adapt, if necessary, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. They're very much looking forward to receiving those standards in order to look into incorporating them into their disclosure regulations. This is completely aligned with the recommendations or directives that IOSCO is giving securities regulators, and so IOSCO is the International Organization of Securities Organizations. It is the federating body, if you will, of the securities regulators in 135 jurisdictions around the world. They cover 95% of capital markets around the world. IOSCO has officially endorsed the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards and is officially recommending its members embrace them and adopt them and incorporate them in their disclosure regulatory regimes. So what's happening in Canada is a reflection of that, and I think we can expect to see that in many other jurisdictions around the world. With respect to the SEC, obviously they are arguably the largest securities commission in the world. The US capital markets represent a big chunk of global capital markets. The SEC has taken a slightly different approach, and in that they have, I would say, taken a topic-based approach, right? We're waiting for the final climate disclosure standards to come out, waiting with bated breath. They're a bit behind schedule, but I think by and large, we're still expecting to come out in the fall. They've taken a very investor-focused approach, a very capital markets focused approach, which is totally fine because that is their remit. And they have aligned with the TCFD recommendations. And also what's interesting to note is that because it's from the SEC, it's a regulation, and they are also calling for the disclosures to be externally audited and for them to be digitized and XBRL tagged. So in very many ways, they are aligning and resembling what we're seeing in the EU and possibly elsewhere. And the fact that they're taking a topic by topic approach, what went completely under the radar for most people is that a few weeks ago, the SEC issued its final disclosure rules for cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is an ESG related issue. Right. Nobody complained about that one. And they're basically telling companies, if you have a major cybersecurity breach, you have to disclose it within 4 days. And you have to disclose your governance on your cybersecurity risk and what you're doing to manage the issue and how it's potentially financially material to you. And your disclosures have to be XBRL tagged. They didn't go the external assurance route for these particular disclosures, but still. And there's also expectations for the SEC to revise their human capital management disclosure rules. And so I think maybe if they take this topic by topic approach, but always with the same process, if you will, or the same parameters of, TCFD aligned context and information, specific quantitative measures, external assurance if possible, XBRL tagged. We're starting to see a lot of similarities and convergence with other jurisdictions around the world.
And it's funny you should comment that the cybersecurity regs were issued without a lot of, shall I say, pushback. I suspect when the climate regs get issued, we are going to get pushback in large part because of the political environment here in the US. I would love for you to comment on the politics around ESG. I don't think they're as severe in Canada as they seem to be here in the US or in other parts of the world. But how do you navigate that?
To be honest, I think many of us outside the US are scratching our heads a little bit.
Well, those of us inside the US are too. But
which is good to know. Good to know and reassuring. I don't see it happening anywhere else than in the US. It has become an exceedingly partisan political issue with no good reason, honestly, because we all must live with the same climate and the consequences of climate change or biodiversity loss or income inequality or any other system level issues, because the US is part of the system like everyone else. And we will succeed in addressing these together or not at all. It's not going to be a geographically defined success or failure. So it's a little unfortunate to see what's happening in the States, but I do think by and large, there are a lot of commonsensical people. And it's interesting if you look at the surveys of the US population in terms of what they think of ESG issues, do they want ESG issues to be, included in their investment options? Do they want companies to behave responsibly and take these issues into consideration, by and large, by a vast majority, and even when you look at surveys of by political affiliation, they're all in favor. So I don't think it's the global or the population in the US that has any particular issues with ESG or whatever you want to call it. There has been a lot of, controversy, if you want to call it that, around the terminology. And I think the whole debate and discussion around the choice of words is a way to avoid the real conversation on the actual issues.
Yeah.
Hopefully that will come to pass. But to answer your question, I don't see it elsewhere. I'm hopeful that it will pass.
Yeah,
and that companies are taking action, state governments are taking action, even the federal government in its current form is taking action, and that combination is going to start generating some results.
Yeah, I think the momentum is moving in the right direction. It's just that there's a lot of headwinds with the politics around it. What do you see, or what are your clients seeing as the biggest challenge at the moment with respect to ESG?
I am happy to answer that question. I will specify that I'm going to take it more from the perspective of sustainability reporting, because that really is where we live and how we engage with our customers. And while there are challenges, or certainly a lot of things to consider in implementing sustainability, a sustainability strategy, incorporating it to the business model, governance, strategy management, risk management, all the way down to reporting. Reporting is actually at the tail end of that process or that cycle. Where we live is really when we get to the reporting space. And what we're seeing right now in terms of the main challenges for companies is this the advent of the new standards. So we talked about the European standards and the CSRD a little while ago. There's also the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, which were finalized end of June as well. Slightly lighter than the European standards, because there's only 2 standards that have come out so far, but they also are combined with the pre-existing SASB standards that were consolidated into the IFRS foundation. And so companies are now needing to grapple with adopting likely one or the other. I think that's going to be a big step change in both cases, especially the case in Europe. The European standards are big. The requirements, the expectations of companies are big. So I think that's a challenge. For the lesser mature companies, so the comments I just made there with respect to looking into adopting the European or the IFRS standards really applies first to the larger, perhaps more mature in their reporting companies, because they've been at it longer and they're the first ones up. For the less mature companies, the ones that are newer to the space, the biggest challenge is, what do I put in my report? What should I be reporting on? What issues should I be managing and therefore reporting on? And often the question is, well, what issues do I put in my report? What data do I put in my report? When in fact, the answer to that question is actually, well, what issues are material to you? Which ones should you be managing in terms of managing your impacts, risks, and opportunities? Some of them you probably already are. You may not be calling them ESG. Some of them might be completely new, and you have to do the work of figuring out if and how they're material. But I think companies, because the driver for them to start doing something is very much reporting, whether they're being asked by investors or even by their large customers. You were talking before about those companies that are part of a supply chain. It's happening all over the place now. The large companies are demanding of their suppliers that they produce certain information and or take certain actions. So the primary driver is often, or the starting point is often, the reporting. And so it's like, okay, I want to report. What do I put in my report? Another challenge that we see a lot still today is resource constraints. My heart goes out to the sustainability teams. They are either non-existent or very, very small in proportion to what they are being asked to do.
Yes.
Chronically understaffed, chronically having to do more, perform better. And they're doing their best. They really are. And they do an outstanding job for the resources they have. And yet, despite the fact that the market is demanding more and more and more and more, compliance and regulatory driven, it seems as though the resources are not following suit, at least not fast enough. And to me, I attribute that to just a lack of knowledge and awareness of the very highest levels of the organization that are going to figure out, okay, we need to do this and we need to do this properly. And this requires resources.
Yes. I completely agree. And that completely aligns with the work I'm doing with my clients. Woefully understaffed. Usually it just lands on somebody's desk and they say, here, can you handle this?
Yes.
In addition
on top of
to
everything else.
Yeah, in addition to their full-time job. And it can't be handled on the side of somebody's desk.
Yeah, and the corollary to that is when they do realize that they need to do more, have more resources, they turn to technology, and technology can be a very valuable tool to help be more efficient, do things faster, do things better, do more things, but it will not replace human involvement. And in my mind, there is no technology that will tell you what your material issues are, or even what data you should be collecting. That work needs to be done by humans in the company, preferably with the highest levels of the organization. And so I think part of the challenge is this expectation that technology is going to solve all their problems and do it for them, but that's really not the reality.
Yeah, I completely agree. So given all of what we've just talked about, the politics and the challenges, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I reflect on that, and I think about that a lot, actually. And I read, people's reactions in the, whether LinkedIn or elsewhere, that whole conversation of, hope versus despair and which one should you have. And I came across something recently that basically the message was, hope isn't necessarily useful, because when you hope, you kind of become oblivious and it's like, oh yeah, it'll all get taken care of. I don't need to do anything. Despair is not hope is not useful either, because if you despair, then you're just completely frozen into inaction, and then we're sure we're not going to solve anything. Mm-hmm. So the suggestion was to cultivate realistic positivity and a radical acceptance of uncertainty. And I think that's a good description of the state of mind that we must keep ourselves in. I often say the only option that is not on the table is doing nothing, because whether or not whatever level we succeed at, it'll be more than if we did nothing. Like doing nothing for sure, guarantees us very dire outcomes and consequences for everybody. And I realize I'm sitting from a place of privilege in a place in the world that is less likely to suffer than others. So I'm extremely privileged. This realistic positivity, I think, is a good way to express a state of mind. And I would say what does give me hope is I see more and more people becoming aware and talking about it, having the courage to speak their mind and to say, this isn't right, something is wrong, we need to do things differently. And hopefully the idea is that we will reach a point of critical mass where that enables whatever new system, whatever new mechanisms, rewriting the rules of the game will enable that to happen.
I really like that you said the only option that's not on the table is the option of doing nothing, because whenever and this goes to our conversation about resources, yes, there is a cost to making these changes, but it pales in comparison to the cost of doing nothing. And, you know, the cost of doing nothing is not an option, or doing nothing is not an option. So if we have a podcast again 1 year from now, what will we talk about? What will have changed?
I suspect a lot, just given the pace of change in this area that hasn't slowed in the last 12 years. It just seems to keep getting faster and faster. So I suspect we will be able to look back and say, oh, well, this happened and this happened and this happened. Probably in a year from now, talking a lot about implementing the European standards, because companies are going to be neck deep in that one. Also, the jurisdictions that are going to be adopting the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, there are quite a few jurisdictions that have announced their intentions to. And I think more will follow suit, and you're going to start to see the concrete realization of that. I think the next issue that everybody is going to be talking about after climate change is biodiversity. And it is even broader and more complex and more all-encompassing than climate change ever was. And the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures will have come out in the fall. And I think that it's going to take companies, again, to a completely different level. And it's going to drive the conversation increasingly towards dependencies and impacts on the ecosystem that companies operate in. So this growing awareness and realization of this interdependency with the ecosystem that companies operate in, and having to look at what those impacts are and to address them, manage them, etc., which is something a lot of companies are not doing today. A lot of people talk about impact, but very few people are actually doing impact or managing their impacts.
Right.
And I think more regulations, and also more verification and investigations of infractions to those regulations. So whether they're, SEC regulatory or securities regulator driven, or whether they are ombuds or NGOs that are keeping watch, I think we're going to see an increasing number of legal action, whether it's on climate, human rights, or biodiversity. And legal action is effective. It drives change. The fear of legal action sometimes is enough to drive change. And that's an encouraging, powerful tool that we will have, that is only possible when regulations are implemented. So that's one of the reasons why regulations are so important. They drive change at scale because they are very effective drivers of behavior change. And I think from a data perspective, we'll be talking a lot about audit readiness, internal controls, data quality, data management, data governance. All of these concepts, by the way, are not new. They exist. They are very well entrenched for all financial data and disclosures. So they're not new to the organizations, they're new to the space of sustainability and ESG. And it's about bringing that knowledge into the sustainability space, but at the same time, bringing the sustainability knowledge and the ESG knowledge to all of those other areas of the business: finance, accounting, internal audit, compliance, legal, that know nothing about ESG.
Yes, it touches everything at a company. It's not a single person's job by any means.
Absolutely.
So I do hope that we chat again a year from now, and we'll look back at your predictions. I hope you're right. I think we will be much further along the journey than we are now in almost more than 12 months could explain, because things are moving so rapidly. Thank you so much.
I would love to do that.
Yes, wouldn't that be great? Okay, so we're on for a year from now. Thank you so much for the insights today, and we'll talk again in 1 year.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you.